Hello and welcome to the Malika Writes channel. My name is Malika Writes and today we are going to be looking at the Proverbs 31 woman in depth. So I'm going to be taking you through the entire proverb, and we are going to be looking at it in the context of the Bible. So I want to begin by reading this quote. Her mindset will raise your children, not her body or good looks. Choose wisely. I think that is important for the topic that we'll be covering today, because we're going to be looking at the ideal woman. The Proverbs 31 woman is what the Bible describes as the ideal woman. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into that. To start, I want to take it back to Genesis, the first book in the Bible. The Bible is made up of 66 books and is divided into two main categories, so the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the New Testament contains the stories about Jesus and the revelation of John. All the stories in the Bible point to the central figure of Jesus Christ, and this is very integral to our understanding of the Proverbs 31 woman. So in the beginning we see God creating order out of chaos, and when order is established, he calls it good. This is because according to the Christian understanding of the world, something is only good when it fulfills its purpose and function. The sun is good because it provides light for things to grow. The darkness is good because it provides a time to rest. When man is created and alone, God says it is not good. That is because he cannot fulfill his purpose and function. It is Adam's job to work in the garden, to populate the earth, and to create new things with the creative ability that God has given him. So Eve is created to accompany Adam. Adam was made first, and so God gave him the instruction not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then God made Eve. Adam names her just as he names the animals, so this kind of puts him in a position of leadership, but he recognizes that she is a person in her own right, with the same rights, liberties, and potential as him. So Adam says this when he first sees Eve: "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." So that word woman, the actual word is isha. So ish is man, isha taken out of man, so woman. He recognizes that she is akin to him. It was Adam's responsibility to ensure that Eve knew the command that God had given regarding the tree they were not supposed to eat from. So let's take a moment to just look at that tree briefly. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In order for mankind to exercise the creative abilities that God had given them, they needed to be able to exercise free will. The character of God in the Bible is one of principle. It would have been much easier to just direct mankind like a puppet on strings, but God doesn't work that way. He's a God of principle. They wouldn't have been able to fulfill their purpose and function, so it wouldn't have been good. So there was always a chance, even within the perfection of Eden and man's pre-fall state, for chaos to reclaim the world. And the balance was if Adam and Eve decided they were going to follow God's rule and follow God's prescription of order, then order would reign. But if they decided to take that knowledge for themselves, if they decided to define good and evil for themselves, then chaos would re-enter. So by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they make the decision to define what is good for themselves, and in doing so they reintroduce chaos back into the world. They also subvert the order which God had established. So Eve is deceived by the serpent, and then Eve tells Adam to eat the fruit. So we have a reversal of the order. So we have where man was on top before, we now have the beast on top. The fall is a natural consequence. Mankind rejects God's order and chooses to make one for themselves, and it leads to chaos. So when we look at God's punishments, we're really just looking at cause and effect. The garden is God's order. By rejecting God's order, they reject the garden, and so they are cast out. Outside of this paradise, pain and toil are very real realities. So what might have been done easily within God's order now becomes a painful and miserable experience. Adam will have to toil to get food from the earth, and Eve will have to bring forth children in pain, and she will always seek to usurp Adam's leadership. Having eaten the fruit first, she will view herself as wiser. However, it is Adam that God holds responsible, which is very interesting, and it speaks to God's character. He's a God of principle. He left Adam in charge, so when everything goes wrong, he puts the fault on Adam. So unlike Eve, Adam was not deceived, which is why God punishes him by saying, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. He had given the command to Adam himself personally. In fact, in Genesis we are told that God often walked in the evenings with Adam. So this command was given to Adam by God himself. And when Eve came to him with the fruit, he ought to have shown leadership and denied it. So because he gave into Eve's promptings, and because he disobeyed God, the bulk of the punishment is on him, and the Bible calls the fall Adam's fall. So it's actually Adam who plunges humanity into chaos. God, however, is merciful. That's one of his characteristics, and he promises that Eve will bear a son, and that son will crush the head of the serpent, and his heel will be bitten by the serpent. This is the first mention of Christ in the Bible, other than when God says, "Let us make man in our image," which is him referring to himself, Christ, and the Holy Spirit, the triune God. So, this is the first time he's mentioned in terms of God speaking to mankind. And it's important that this promise is made to Eve and not to Adam, because Jesus is born of miraculous conception through a virgin. This showcases our first attribute of the Proverbs 31 woman, submission to God's divine order. This means a commitment to the maintenance of order and the rejection of chaos. And this doesn't necessarily mean striving to keep the peace no matter what and doing anything and everything to keep the peace, because sometimes disruption is needed. It means making active contributions to facilitating an environment that kindles hope, allows life to flourish, and stops potential from becoming chaos. It's like when you have a child, they are naturally chaotic. They want to see the world. There's so much potential in a child, but a parent's job is to guide that and to stop that from becoming anarchy and chaos, and just keep that at potential so that the child grows properly and can contribute to society positively. So that word submission, let's just linger there for a moment. Submission has always been a very tricky word because it has been so abused. The word submission has been used to facilitate abuse so many times over the course of history, you can't even count it. The way that the Bible sees submission, however, has everything to do with that divine order I was talking about. Later on in Genesis, we get a picture of worldly submission or secular submission through the character of Lamech, who comes from the line of Cain. So just briefly, for those who are not familiar with the story, Cain is the son of Adam and Eve after they've been rejected from Eden. So Cain murders his younger brother Abel, and he is cast out from the sight of God, and he goes on to have his own children, and Lamech is one of his descendants. So Lamech has two wives called Zillah and Ada. So Zillah means wife of Lamech, and Ada means ornament. So we go from Ish and Isha, which mean man and woman, to very respectable titles, to Lamech having a name and his wives being called wife of Lamech and ornament. It's not going great outside the realm of Eden, as we can see. Mankind does not have the capability to create the sort of order that God created. So by taking the ability to define good and evil for themselves, they cannot master the chaos outside of themselves. And even though they create civilizations, there's corruption, there's vices inside those civilizations that they create. So it's not the good, fair environment that Eden was. Lamech comes up in Genesis, and he comes up interestingly in a gap between this long list of genealogies. So Lamech has this little speech that gives us an insight into the type of person that he is. And I'm just going to read out that speech. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So that's very interesting, because when we look at Bible symbolism, 7 is the number of completeness. So he's basically saying when Cain was cast out of the presence of God, he was cursed. So he's basically saying that he is strong enough to take on that curse. His vengeance is 77-fold complete. So he is threatening his wives. He's saying, I have killed a man for hurting me. I have killed a young boy for striking me. He's basically displaying the tyrannical manifestation of masculinity. He's very much, he's got two wives. He's very much the sort of alpha in this situation. But what he's portraying is tyrannical. It's not great. It's toxic masculinity. Don't be Lamech. And don't go for a Lamech. Depending on who's watching this video, but don't go for a Lamech. That's the message of that. Because he is outside of the will of God. And the reason why Lamech's speech comes in between these genealogies is because we have to get an idea of just how far humanity has fallen, essentially. In striving to define good and evil for themselves, they've slipped more into evil, because there, as we see in the Garden of Eden, humanity has a weakness towards sin. There is something about us that is weak towards temptation, and so we just continue to slip even further and further away from the perfection that Eden was. So when it comes to Ada and Zillah, their submission is a display of cultural submission, but it's not biblical. They submit to Lamech out of fear and necessity, and not because they agree with his mission. Biblical submission is not the absence of free will. It's a choice to get behind the mission, to adhere to the order of God, or to reject it and make your own. And that's one of the other attributes of the Proverbs 31 woman. Her husband trusts her because he knows she is on board with his mission. And that's the whole idea of the biblical marriage. So let's just talk about the biblical marriage for a second. When in Genesis we are told that a man will leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife and they shall become one. That whole idea of becoming one means that you both have the same vision for your life. And that's the whole big deal about believers not being yoked with unbelievers. That idea of a yoke comes from when you have two oxen pulling a plough. You don't want one oxen that's a lot stronger than the other and one that's weaker. So you have to be equally yoked. And so when it comes to the biblical marriage, it's not just a union between two people, it's actually an illustration of Christ and his church. And so when we're talking about submission, we're saying, are you on board with creating this picture? Are you on board with demonstrating this illustration to the world? Are you on board with the mission? And that's what biblical submission is all about. It's difficult to imagine a perfect world, but try to imagine perfection as much as you can. Eden, before the fall, was a perfect world. There was nothing wrong with it. There was nothing that needed to change about it. But even within this perfect world, there was work to be done. There was space for improvement. There was potential for something more. Adam and Eve were required to work. Our view of heaven stems from popular culture for the most part, and this even works its way into Christian circles. Oftentimes we imagine fluffy clouds with people playing harps and spending blissful eternity resting and doing nothing. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, that's not the biblical view of heaven at all. And I mean, it would get a bit boring after a while if you had to spend eternity doing absolutely nothing. So, unfortunately, you won't be doing a lot of lounging if you get in. As demonstrated in Genesis, God is not a lazy being, and human beings created in his image should not be lazy either. Humans were designed for work amidst perfection, and when heaven and earth are remade, are recreated at the end of days, humans shall engage in work for eternity. And so here we confront another cultural mandate of femininity. Just as we previously encountered the cultural definition of submission versus the biblical definition of submission, here we encounter the cultural mandate of femininity, the image of the guarded princess. In many cultures, paler skin is revered. Not because every single culture around the world has been brainwashed by white people. It's because if you were privileged enough to stay indoors, out of the sun, it was a marker of wealth. You wouldn't be under the sun working. So now that being outdoors in tropical places is a marker of wealth because you need money to go on holidays, being more tanned is considered more attractive. So this just tells us that culture is fickle, and what we really need is an eternal or more constant model of femininity that can cope with the reality of the world and contribute to this divine order. So in order to understand why the Proverbs 31 woman is the ideal woman in the Bible, we have to look at the book of Revelation, which is the last book of the Bible. Revelation is the final book, and it's written by a man named John. The book describes the trials and tribulations that Christians will endure, but it also promises a heaven and earth that are remade. So, Eden was much more than just a garden. It was a place where heaven and earth were united. And so we have God coming down and walking with Adam in the cool of the evening. This is a place where man and heaven and God can be united. So when man introduces chaos back into the world, what we have is a disconnect between heaven and earth. But the promise at the end of this, and the whole point of Jesus himself, is so that we can be reunited with heaven. So Eden was perfect. Let's try and imagine a perfect place. Try and imagine a place that is perfect. You're working, everyone's working in the garden, you're tending to the animals, you're tending to the land, you're creating things. Imagine the elves in Valinor. For those of you who have read the Silmarillion, try to imagine the lives of the elves in Valinor. And that Tolkien drew his influence from this understanding, from this accurate understanding of what heaven is like. It's not lounging around, it's not necessarily being united with every single loved one that you've lost. It's about being in the glory of God, because remember, the elves were right next to the Valar. They were able to witness the glory of the trees, they were able to witness the grandeur of the Valar. So it's about that proximity. So Valinor is this place where the earth and where the glory of Eru Iluvatar himself are displayed in its completion, essentially. So this is what Eden is in the biblical tradition. Jesus is all about linking us and taking on that sin, linking us back to this view of perfection. So when it comes to the end of days, these saints will be resurrected. Our houseless spirits shall be given physical bodies once more, because remember, it's not about being these airy-fairy sort of spirits in the sky. It's about our bodies are intrinsic to us as well. And so we shall be given physical bodies once again, and we shall work as we were supposed to. So think of the advancements that we've made in civilization. Those don't just sort of go away. Our knowledge of the world doesn't just go away. We're able to progress, but in a way that is orderly, in a way that submits to the divine order of God. So let's just take a brief second before we actually get to the proverb itself to talk about the difference between heaven and hell. So you've probably heard about hell, this fiery lake that punishes the wicked and all of that, and God's retribution rains down on them and all of that stuff. And we've heard of heaven as being this magical place that you get to enjoy for eternity. There's golden streets and jasper and all that stuff. Well, the main difference between them is one is in the presence of God and one is in the absence of God. So it's not necessarily about retribution and all of that. The crux of it is that those who go to heaven want to be under the divine order of God, and those who go to hell want to be without the divine order of God. And so all the hellish things that humans are able to do, even though God still rules over this earth and everything happens according to his will, imagine now taking all hope, imagine taking hope away from the situation. Imagine you're in a hopeless situation, you know there is no end, it goes on for eternity, the worst of humanity is unleashed, there are no rules left, it's straight anarchy. That is what hell is. It's basically humans do as thy will, and there are no constraints, there's no moral constraint. That all goes out the window, because the conscience is gone, the presence of God itself is gone, and those who desire to be within the presence of God and be under that divine order go to heaven. That's how it works. It's not necessarily, oh well, if I just live a good life. It's more complicated than that. It's more about where do you want to be, so what do you want to follow, essentially. And that's the original sin. It's basically, you sin the original sin all the time if you decide to live your life according to if you decide to define good and evil according to your own terms. And that's basically what that is in the Christian worldview. Of course, this opens up very complicated debates that we don't necessarily have time to go into here, because I do want to get to the text. But this is always something that we can discuss, you guys can go ahead and discuss it in the comment section. I will obviously chip in. If there are any questions that I think I can answer in a Q&A, I will do that. So without further ado, let's get more towards the text, because we do have a lot to get through in this video. So this brings us at last to the proverb itself. The context of this is a king reciting some words of wisdom. So that tells us the description of this woman that we're about to read is fit to be the queen that sits next to a king of a nation. So we're not just talking necessarily about a working class woman, because with the whole thing about work, we would think this is something for the working class, but it's not. This is what a queen should behave like according to the divine order of God. This is something that is fit for a queen as well as fit for someone who is not a queen. This is what women should be striving for. This is the ideal woman. And she says to him, "What are you doing, my son? What are you doing, son of my womb? What are you doing, son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women." So let's just pause there, because that can become very confusing. It's like, oh, what do you mean don't give your strength to women? So there in the Greek and Hebrew text, the word it's trying to use actually means adulteress. So it's don't give your strength to adulteresses. Don't engage in undisciplined sexual behavior. Don't engage in sexual behavior outside of the covenant. That's what it's basically saying. So don't dishonor the covenant by sleeping with women who are in a marital covenant themselves, and don't give yourself to women who are basically women of the night, to put it politely. And that's, again, going back to that biblical view of marriage. It's not just two people. It's about, it's basically about creating this image, or reflecting the image of God's love for us. So it's supposed to be a picture, an illustration. Just as we are made in God's image, a marriage should be an illustration of the relationship between Christ and his church. And so she's basically saying to her son, do not dishonor that covenant, because that's very important. Don't dishonor the covenant. So she says, do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. I'm pretty sure we have all come across the story of Helen of Troy and how that destroyed a whole kingdom. So this is not referring to that, but it's referring to this behavior of just throwing away your principles for momentary pleasure. And this could come in the form of a woman. This could come in the form of warmongering. This could come in many forms. Alcohol, as it's about to mention here. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. So it's basically saying, and the word it tries to use is the law. So it's basically saying, if you drink, you will forget yourself, but you will also forget the law. And this is Jewish law it's talking about. So you'll forget your commandments, you'll forget your commitment to God if you drink too much. And so it's basically calling him to be a higher person. It's saying, don't forget yourself. So he is a king, he's got commitments that he has to live up to, so he can't afford to drink and to forget himself. So this is trying to remind him of that. Give strong drink to the one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So this is very valiant, it's very heroic. It's what a king is supposed to do. He's supposed to protect. And it's interesting that we get this advice about what a king is supposed to do, what the ideal man is supposed to do, just before we get what his helpmeet is supposed to do. And that's always been a tricky word, because in the Bible, Eve or women have been described as helpers, and people often feel offended by this description. But when we find out what the Bible asks of its helpers, I think it becomes less offensive and it becomes actually a lot more empowering. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax, and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchants. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night, and provides food for her household, and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor, and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed covers for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. So this is a very lovely passage, and as we can see, the ideal woman is a working woman. I've spoken about this so many times in various videos. My Femininity in Crisis video is where I spoke the most about our historical misunderstanding about the work of women. We often think that women did not work, they just stayed home. That comes from an inaccurate understanding of history and how difficult it was, and how you couldn't afford to stay home, and how the middle class really only emerged during the Industrial Revolution. So for the vast majority of human history, women have had to work. There hasn't really been that much of a middle class. So when we're talking about women's work, it's clearly prized. And this is the description for a queen. This is what we're expecting of royalty, not just the middle class, but the upper class. And within this divine order, because remember, we're not just talking about a secular environment, we're talking about a biblical order. In the supposed perfect world, in the Garden of Eden, what we have is a working woman, someone who actively contributes and facilitates an environment that life can flourish in. So let's just take a moment to look at what is asked um, of the king. So when we look at the description of him, what the Bible is asking of him is, do not drink, do not take substances that distract you from the reality. And this is something that is perfectly reasonable to ask, because if you have a weak leader, you have a weak nation. And that was basically a death sentence at that time. I mean, it's still of massive consequence now. We've seen the effects of this in various countries where leadership has fallen through and the people have suffered. So it's still as relevant today as it was back then. But it's very important to note that the consequences were a lot more immediate. If you had a weak leader, there was no safety net. The nation was not so well established to the point where if a leader was weak, you could have, your nation wouldn't crumble. Things were very volatile in the past. We have so much stability that sometimes we take it for granted, but things were very volatile in the past. So to have a leader that was consumed with drink, there was always an enemy nation ready to take over. In our modern day, countries are not as willing or are not as focused on taking over other countries as they were in the past. I mean, you still have some arguably, but they're not. It's not as prevalent as it was in the past. So even if you did have weak leadership, as some would argue, America's had weak leadership. It's debatable, but some would say there was no nation coming to take over America. That wasn't happening. But in the past, that would have been a very real fear and very real reality. So it's very important that he's not intoxicated, that he's present, he's protecting the people, that his strength is not used to create tyranny, it's actually used to create borders and these boundaries that will protect people. And that will also protect him from giving way to his more carnal nature, which is to sleep with women and which is to drink. So these boundaries are not just for the society he protects, they're also for himself. And it's very important to remember that the society and the self both benefit from discipline, diligence, and integrity. So when it comes to the helpmeet, she has to also make sure that she handles herself. She has to be disciplined because like we hear, her candle does not go out at night. This is a woman that works very hard. She has responsibilities, so she has to take care of people. This is someone who is very hardworking, and we're also looking at someone who cares. She's looking after the people within this community. She's making sure they're fed. So it's not just her household, it's also the maidens that serve her. They are fed from her own hands. She's not waiting for people to cook for her. She's doing it herself. So we've got a very proactive woman. At the end, it says a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Now I just want to look at that word fears, because sometimes it can be taken a little bit out of context when we're talking about it. I'm just finding the translation that I have here on my phone. So that fears, so it's not, there is an element of fear to it, because not only is God a God of mercy and goodness, but he's also a God of judgment. He's also a God of principle. So he's not this caricature of love that we've made him in modern society. This is a God of wrath. This is a God that decided to drown the entire world because it was not fit for his purposes. It had gone so far away from its function and purpose that it could only be disposed of, save Noah and his family. So we're looking at a God that is capable of violence. He's capable of executing his will. He's perfectly capable of that. So when we're talking about this fear, it's not just fear. It actually refers to morally reverent. So someone who adheres to the divine order of God is to be praised. That's what this passage is trying to say. It's not just fear, it's about being morally reverent. And that's one of the qualities that this woman has. So going further up again, we're kind of darting all over the place here, but it's just to give you an overall basis of the proverb and how it can relate to your life, and also its significance and how it ties up to the larger biblical story. It's not just a standalone. And that's one thing you really learn about the Bible, is that everything inside the Bible it's not just a standalone. It's definitely a strong enough piece of writing to stand alone, but it's part of this bigger story. And that bigger story is with Christ. So when it comes to this image of femininity, it may not necessarily make sense within the cultural realm, because like we've said, submission in our secular society means sometimes has a more sinister take to it, and it can be easily exploited. So one of the things that the Bible says about that is where it says, women, be submissive to your own husbands, not to Samantha's husband or Amber's husband, but to your own. So it's not all men, it's to the men in your life who have authority over you. So your father and your husband, and obviously your Lord. So it's not just any man on the street, it's not just a general rule, it's very specific. So when it comes to this whole thing of comparing her to Jules, saying who can find this rare gem, it's because the Bible recognizes that this is something that's difficult to achieve. We're talking about a woman who is not only hardworking but provides for others as well as herself, and she also is somebody whose external beauty is not the marker of her excellence. And that's probably what I want to focus on for a little bit, where it says she dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. This is a woman whose hard work, whose ability to facilitate an environment that cultivates hope and life and contributes to maintaining an order that is profitable not just for herself but for society as a whole. This is what makes the Proverbs 31 woman the ideal woman. It's not her beauty, because at the end here it says, charm is deceitful and beauty is vain. It is so easy to put on makeup and to look good and to personify this cultural version of femininity. But it's a lot harder to actually instill the values behind that. So if we go back to our understanding of what good is, and that's why we went to Genesis, because in order to understand why this Proverbs 31 woman is the ideal woman, we have to have a good understanding of what good constitutes in the Bible. And that is when something fulfills its purpose and function, when it adheres to the divine order that God has established. And this woman does. She is basically fulfilling the role that God has given her. She's also fulfilling the divine purpose of humanity, which is to advance creatively, create environments where life can flourish, and to adhere to his will. So it's what we're seeing here is not a cultural definition of femininity. It's one that has its roots all the way in Genesis. It's one that will reach its completion in Revelation. So that's the reason why we had to kind of go back and forth, as confusing as that was. But it was in order for everyone here to see the full picture and to understand why exactly is this the ideal woman. And it's because it fits in with the divine mandate that God has given humanity. When we look at that word excellent, the word it uses here is virtuous. So, or a woman who displays valor or valiant. So, what we're talking about is a victorious version of femininity. It's one that fits in with this glorious story that we have going here in the Bible. And so just picking out quickly some of the values that are here. So we have loyalty, we have obviously diligence, we have discipline. She's able to wake up very early and prepare food for everyone. She is obviously very hardworking because that takes a lot of effort. Anyone who's had to get up at an ungodly time will tell you that it takes a lot of effort. And then temptation to just lay back down for 5 minutes is unreal. And that 5 minutes subsequently turns into like 5 hours. So, and it makes a whole big deal about the fact that she is not concerned with her looks. She does not neglect her outward appearance. As it says, she clothes herself in fine linen and purple is a very rich color. It's one that's it's one that's used to connotate royalty, so purple is a very rich color. So she's not neglecting her physical appearance, she's taking care of it, but that's not the essence of her femininity. The essence of her femininity is the way that she treats those in her charge. So if we look at how she manages this household, she maintains the established order, and that's basically femininity. That's the feminine woman, a woman who can maintain the order, who when her husband is away at war or in the fields or at work, maintains the order within her household but also outside. This is not a woman confined to the house, and there is a reason for this, because she's supposed to be part of a Christian community, and that Christian community isn't just in her house, it's not just her children. So and this is also a queen who has duties to the entire nation. And so, like I was saying, this is not just a woman who is operating within her household. This is a queen who has a duty to the entire nation. So she's not just operating within a limited environment. And so, how does this sort of relate to our world? Because we're not obviously asking people to buy land that's very expensive, and this is a standard, so it's not something that people will necessarily reach easily. It's not meant to be obtained easily. It's something that you have to go through a journey to obtain. It's not something that you're necessarily born with. You're not born with business sense or the ability to spot good land. So that's not it's not something that you necessarily as a person have to beat yourself up over if you don't meet that standard as of yet. But I do think that we can benefit from going back to the value system rather than the external, because when we focus on just the external elements of femininity or masculinity, for example, what we end up doing is having all of the props that make us look like we are fulfilling our role and our purpose and function, but we don't have the substance. And that is a dangerous game to play, because it's the substance, it's the value that gives that fulfillment. So when we're looking at the Proverbs 31 woman, some of you may be asking, how do you become the Proverbs 31 woman? How do you navigate that in our world that seems so materialistic and it's become so individualistic that community almost means nothing. And how do you navigate this in a secular world? So the first sort of tip that I would give is really to figure out what you believe. We're obviously drawing from a religious text. This is something that Christians adhere to. This is something I adhere to. So for me, it's a little bit easy because I believe in the whole thing. But if you don't and you're living in a secular world, it can obviously be a little bit more difficult to take advice from something that's religious. But what I would say is that figure out what you believe. That's the first step I would probably recommend for both femininity and masculinity, is to figure out, what do you believe about the world? What do you believe about yourself? And what do you believe about society in general? And I would encourage you to really grapple with that. I don't think it's something that may necessarily take a day. I suggest, writing it down, seeing what your thoughts are like over a month. You could keep a diary. A month might even be too short. Just let's say 3 months. Write down what you believe and what you think, and also write down your daily activities, because I believe that human beings are just repetition of habits. So see what you do, get to know yourself, because when you know who you are, you're able to have a realistic picture of where you are in terms of how well do you match up to the standard, and how well do you know yourself, and are you operating within the environment that you're in. The next thing I would sort of look at is survey, and this is kind of a latch on from the one I've just mentioned, which is survey where you are right now. So when I say that, I'm talking about, where are you in life? How are you doing in life? Have you met your milestones? Have you accomplished what you set out to accomplish? What is the state of your life? Are you living in a way that makes you proud, or are you living in a way that if someone had to actually view your life, you wouldn't be proud to show this off? If that's the case, then the next step would be to, well, what do I want my life to look like? And measure the steps between where you are now and where you want to be, and see what small steps you can take to get to towards where you want to be. Because I don't believe you can just fly to your destination. You do have to take baby steps, and it's more realistic that way, because you're more likely to keep to it if you're taking small steps towards that. So that could be eating healthier, so going to the gym, or maybe not even going to the gym, taking a walk, getting more activity. I know from personal experience that it's not necessarily what I eat, it's just my lack of activity, because I spend most of the time sitting down in front of a computer. So having activity and getting up once in a while, walking around and going for a walk is very important. So it's little changes like that make a big difference. It may not even be with your weight, it may be with your mental space. You may not be able to afford a therapist, so try writing things down. Try speaking to someone that you trust, getting in touch with someone that is perhaps older, someone who you would go to for advice, someone who's a good listener. So little things in that case can really help you get started. Where changing your circumstance, changing your way of life, changing whatever, it takes time. It's not something you're just going to get now. I think the most important part is visualizing where you want to be. And I don't say visualizing in the sort of law of attraction sense where you're, if you just believe hard enough. I believe in taking practical and realistic steps and taking actual action. Faith without works is dead. So I believe in actually making sure that you're doing something towards that, making practical steps. And when it comes to therapy, it's great because it allows you to talk about your problems with someone who's a professional, someone who is able to decipher what you've told them, but it does nothing unless you take practical steps. So what I'm advising is be real with yourself, look at where you are now, because you know yourself, you know the secret things in your head, you know the thoughts that pop up in your head, you know the reality of your situation. So look at where you are now, look at where you want to be. You can use this model, you can modify it according to how you live. If you're a Christian, you can use this model. If you're not, modify it, take parts that you agree with and leave out those that you don't. It's up to you. And then look at what you can do to get there. If it means getting up earlier, or if it means calling that person in your family that you haven't spoken to for a long time, that you know kind of needs somebody to be there for them. Looking at your friendship groups, do people, when people come to you, do they leave more fulfilled, or do they leave depleted? Asking yourself questions like that will help you take a step in the right direction. It's also about taking accountability for your life and really making sure that you understand that everything that happens in your life is more or less, with small variations, or more or less everything that happens in your life is either indirectly or directly a consequence of your actions. So basically watching what you do, watching what you say, watching what you're thinking and indulging in will really help you in making a positive change in your life, if that's what you want to do. If you're happy with yourself, then great, that's brilliant. We like people who are happy with themselves. But if you believe that you have room for improvement, as I personally believe everyone does, then perhaps take the time to look at where you are and where you would like to be, and take small steps towards it. It's not something that you have to rush. At the end of the day, you have a life in front of you, so it's not something you have to speed towards, and you're not going to be able to speed towards it, because these are fundamental things that you have to rethink. Femininity and masculinity are not just concepts floating out in the cosmos. They are very real and very relevant, and we live with them and we interact with them every day. So when it comes to unlearning the things that culture has told us about femininity and masculinity, I think it's something that we all have to take time to actually look at and reflect on. So that's enough rambling from me. I'm going to end this video here because I'm pretty sure it's a very long video. If you're stuck through to the end, well done. You have a lot of patience, and thank you for having that much patience with me. But yeah, this has been the Malika Writes channel. I hope you have a brilliant day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share this with anyone you think may like it. My name is Malika Writes, and this has been the Malika Writes channel. Have a great day.